The project actually began with a phone call from someone named Sandra Koifman. Sandra is a psychologist. And when I was at the Holocaust Center, we did these huge student programs, and Sandra was a facilitator at one of the programs. So I didn't know her well, but I knew her enough to be friendly. And when I wrote one of my books, she had me come and speak to one of her groups, and I did an ethical will writing session with some of her friends. And she called me up and she said, I've got this idea. I would like to interview people 100 and over. I'd like to interview 100 people 100 years and over. And I said, sounds like a great idea, but it's not going to happen because I don't think we would find 100 people 100 years old and over that can really speak. I said, but I think we could do 90 over 90. So she said, would you be willing to help me? Because I don't think I want to do this project alone. With all your legacy work and your work with Holocaust survivors, I think this might be something that you could help me do. And so I said yes. And so that's how we started. Sandra asked one of her friends, who is a graphic designer, who actually designed the icon for the Wisdom of the Century project. We decided to name it Wisdom of the Century. And this person only stayed with us for a very short time, and then she left. At the same time, Nicole was the person who was the graphic designer. Nicole asked her friend Pipe Yanguis, I think that's how you pronounce it, if he would do the photography. And he's a professional photographer, and he agreed to do this. And when the graphic designer quit, I spoke to Jenny Menzel, who is my graphic designer for my books, and I asked her if she'd be willing to work. So we were all doing this, certainly not getting paid. We were doing it because we wanted to do it, because the project excited us. So that's how we began. And the original idea was to create a coffee table book with photographs of each person, one photograph of each person, and their story in probably 4, 5, 6 paragraphs, and their words of wisdom. Because really the focus of the book was to get as much as we could in terms of their life lessons, to learn from them, so we could pass along those life lessons to this generation and future generations. And so we began. And how did we begin? We started talking to people and asking people if they knew anyone over 90 who would be willing to be interviewed. And what was really important to us was that we got a cross section of people. So we knew we wanted to interview just people in Florida. Originally, we were thinking of going all over the country, but that didn't last very long. So we began with South Florida. And Sandra and I live in different communities within the same community. She is Hispanic, and so many of her friends are Hispanic. And she's from Colombia. And I'm not, so, but we're both Jewish. And so we started, a lot of the original people were people that we knew, you know, friends of ours who had grandparents or whatever, who would be willing to be interviewed. And then we quickly realized that we needed diversity. So it was Sandra, who was the founder of the project and who really oversaw every aspect and has overseen every aspect of it, who started going out into the community. So for example, she went to Black churches and she went to mosques. She went to some of the reservations of the indigenous people. She went all over looking for people so that we would have a cross section of South Florida and of Florida itself. And many of the people that Sandra interviewed, their first language was Spanish. So Sandra interviewed the Hispanic speaking people, and I interviewed the English speaking people. And what she would do was she would then transcribe the interviews and send them to me. And so ultimately I wrote up each of the interviews, all of the 90 interviews. And from those, I took out the lessons that they learned. And so in the book, on one side is the image of the person, the photograph, and the other side is one whole column of their story, and then another column, mostly for most of them, another column of words of wisdom. And so that's how it began. And we started, I think our first interview was in December of 2021. And it took us until about the beginning of this year to actually finish the interviews. And then so I was editing them all along. I would write them and then edit them. And then the entire team edited all of them to make sure, for example, the ones that Sandra did, I wanted to make sure that I had the information correct. And Pipe, who had been at every single interview, was the one who really had the overview. I mean, he was the lucky one who got to sit in every interview. So that's how it began. Somewhere down the line, when we started thinking about the launch, Sandra wanted to do it in a museum. And so one of the museums that I suggested was the History Miami Museum. I knew that it was on the plaza in downtown, which was pretty central. And it's on the same plaza as the main library. And 39 years ago, in December of 1985, I brought the Anne Frank exhibit to that plaza in the library. And so when we went to the History Museum, we both fell in love with it. They were very welcoming and said, yes, we could have the book launch there. And then they took us through the museum and we saw this exhibit room. And all of a sudden we said, you know what? We could create an exhibit with the photographs. And so that led into the next part of the project, which is we will now be having an exhibition for 2 months from the date of the launch, which is December 12th, through February 16th at the museum as well.